So I can get us started. Welcome everyone. My name is Eileen Herrera, and I'm on the Selective Mutism Association's Board of Directors. Before we get started today, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, being that the webinar today is being recorded and will be put on SMA's YouTube channel. For those of you registrants, you'll also receive a link to the recording within a few business days. We also wanted to let you all know, of course, that this webinar isn't approved for any continuing education credits. And for our speech language pathologists, while this webinar is not approved for ASHA credits, it can be used for professional development hours. For anyone, if you need a certificate of attendance, please reach out to Kristen Leos. I'm going to put her email in the chat for you all to have access. In order to receive the certificate, you do need to attend the entire presentation. And finally, throughout the webinar today, please feel free to add any questions that you have in the chat, or we also have the Q&A feature. I will be monitoring questions throughout so that Emily can field them either during the presentation, or there's also going to be time at the very end. And without further ado, I'll let Emily take us away.
Great. Thanks so much, Eileen. I'm just going to pull my presentation up here and then we can get started. So my name is Emily Laracy. I'm a school-based speech language pathologist and also an SMA board member. I'm the secretary for the board of directors. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you guys about a topic that I think is really important and helpful for working with our students with SM. I kind of geared this presentation toward professionals who might be working with students with SM, but if you're a parent or a family member, I'm sure there will be ideas and activities here that will be really helpful to you too. So as Eileen said, I encourage you to put questions in the chat. I'm going to try to keep up with it as I'm talking, but I'll also save some time at the end for kind of more general questions. As we get started, we just want to start with a thank you to the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation. It is thanks to a grant from them that we're able to do a lot of these webinars, and so we're grateful for their support in our work at SMA. So just a little bit of background about me. As I said, I'm a school-based SLP. I primarily work with elementary and middle school grades, although I have worked all the way up with our 21-year-old population. On my caseload, I have students with SM as well as several other diagnoses. I've worked as a teletherapist with grades K to 12. I currently work as an adjunct professor and clinical supervisor at a university with a speech and hearing clinic here in Pennsylvania. For many years, I've served as either a lead teacher or a one-on-one counselor at several different intensive SM treatment programs. So I've gotten a lot of experience with this population through that. As I said, I'm the secretary for the SMA Board of Directors, and my disclosures tonight are that I'm the author of a book and a webinar with Northern Speech Services that I do get royalties from that are on the topic of SM. So our objectives for tonight, we're really going to focus on higher level social language goals. So once we've kind of mastered the art of asking questions and answering questions with our kids, what else do they need to work on to be able to interact socially in age appropriate ways with peers and adults? So we'll be talking about goals that we can work on, activities that we can engage in to create some functional ways to practice those things, and making sure that kids get lots of practice with those. And for those of you who are either working with schools or working in schools, I've included some sample SMART goals that you could use and tweak for your IEPs and 504 processes if you find that that's something that you need to target some of these things. So our agenda tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the hierarchy of skills that go into social language development and what kind of prerequisite skills we need in order to engage in social language effectively. We'll talk about what do we mean by higher level goals and what all does that consist of. And then specifically, we'll spend some time focusing on what does it look like to work on initiating, what does it look like to work on some of those trickier greetings and farewells and sort of polite words and social niceties, some goals related to peer relationships, and then we'll kind of wrap up and save some time for questions. So starting with social language in general, When we think about social language, I think there's a lot of different ways we can conceptualize it. But one way that I like to think about it is kind of this five-step hierarchy, starting with some really early foundational skills and building up to what we're going to focus on tonight with these higher level skills. So you can think about these foundational skills are skills that, infants and toddlers are demonstrating. So things like eye contact, joint attention, responding to their name, using early gestures, things like waving and pointing, head nods and shaking, things like that. So we see several of these early things emerging very early in childhood. Question in the chat about slides. Yes, you'll get these slides will be sent out to you. So don't feel like you need to rush to screenshot anything. You will get a copy of these. So we see these foundational skills emerge pretty early on, even before we see kids using verbal skills for social interactions. And then as kids start to build their verbal skills, we start to see them responding in communication. So they move on to being able to answer questions and respond to other people when they're prompted. And then we start to see them use reciprocal communication. So that's when we start to see that back and forth. So rather than just answering a question, they're kind of sharing that conversational turn. So they're answering a question and then maybe asking another question back to the other person, or making a comment and leaving room for the other person to respond to it. So we start to see these conversations taking place where instead of it just being a single interaction of someone asks a question, the child answers it, and then that's the end of the interaction, we see this back and forth where it can go on for several different conversational turns, and kids start to be able to navigate staying on topic and changing topics and making comments and contributing to conversations. So those are often the skills that I see us working on really, really well in our SM treatment. And then I think sometimes we get to that point where we've got kids engaging in reciprocal communication. They're able to ask and answer questions. Maybe they're starting to make comments. And that can be really helpful and productive. But I want to make sure that we don't stop there with our treatment, because there's still more skills that our kids may need to work on and may need explicit practice in order to be able to engage in the full range of social interactions that might be expected for their age. So after we see kids kind of interacting responsibly in that turn-taking piece, then the next step is then that initiation piece. So can kids spontaneously, without any prompting or any kind of conversational framework, can they make comments? Can they make requests of people? Can they invite others to play or talk to other people? And then from there, we really start to talk about what I'm referring to as these higher level social language goals. So can we use some of those polite types of words, like saying hello or goodbye, saying please, thank you, excuse me, I'm sorry, those types of words? Can they express opinions, especially if those opinions might be different than what the peer group or what the group around them are currently expressing? Can they adjust their communication based on the situation? So a lot of times we talk differently to a peer than we do to a teacher. We talk differently in an informal setting than we do in a formal setting. Can they clarify things? If their message is not understood, if someone doesn't understand, either hear them completely or understand what they're saying or know what they're talking about, can they provide more background information? Can they clarify their information? Can they advocate for themselves? So that includes asking for help, asserting themselves, asking people to stop doing something if it's hurtful or bothersome. Can they engage in conflict resolution and negotiations? That can often be tricky for some of our kids. And then understand some of those non-literal meanings. So understand kind of the social rules of a situation when they walk into a situation, kind of establishing what's going on, what's expected or not expected in those situations, and understanding kind of non-literal meanings for things. So understanding sarcasm, understanding how intonation can change the meaning of a sentence, understanding figurative language and things like that. So we're not going to have time to talk about all of these different things tonight, but I've picked out a handful of these things that I think are really critical for our kids with SM to work on. And I'm going to include both these steps 4 and 5 in our talk tonight, the initiation piece, and then some of those other higher language pieces. So I want to think about the fact that developmentally, we might think about these skills in a hierarchy, right? Of building from those foundational pre-verbal skills to the responsiveness, to the reciprocal communication, and then to the initiation, and then the higher level skills. In reality, we're using a mix of all of those skills in any type of interaction. So this is kind of a loose framework of some of the skills that are involved in having a basic conversation. So we see some of those early foundational skills. Often in conversations, we're making eye contact with the people we're talking to. We're often including a greeting. So now we've jumped from that foundational skill up to that higher level skill of using a greeting. So we might initiate a greeting like, hey, what's your name? Hey, I have something to tell you. Hey, do you have a minute? We might respond to a greeting. If someone says like, oh, what's up? How are you today? How was your weekend? We have to respond to those things. And then once we've worked through that initial kind of give and take of the greeting, then we have to start the conversation. And then we have to engage in things like waiting your turn to speak, giving others the opportunity to speak, making comments that are relevant, asking questions about what we're talking about, making sure we're staying on topic, but also knowing when it's appropriate to kind of shift the topic or to kind of move from one topic of conversation to the next or kind of subtopics within a conversation. We need to be able to do that clarification piece. So that's that self-advocacy. So if someone says something and we're confused about it, can we ask a question about it? And then being able to end the conversation, right? So you may have been in conversations before with maybe someone who's still practicing those skills, and they might just kind of awkwardly walk away before you've kind of ended the conversation. We come to expect people to say something like, well, I've got to go, or it was so great to see you, or okay, I'll see you tomorrow. Something like that to kind of wrap up the conversation and signal that it's finished. So this is just kind of a small sampling of some of the skills that we use in conversation, but you'll see this is much more than just kind of asking a question, answering a question, asking a question, answering a question. There's a lot more nuance that goes into it and a lot of different types of skills that are involved in these things. And I could probably go through and make a much more extensive um, list of skills, but this kind of captures a lot of the main ones. There's a great question in the chat. At what age do you expect these skills to come out? It really depends. You can look up a lot of pragmatic language, kind of developmental norms online, and a lot of them I see expect kids to master most of these skills by age 5. The one that comes a little bit later is like that non-literal language piece, so understanding the figurative language and sarcasm and things like that. That's later, middle to later elementary school years that we tend to look for those things. But really, a lot of these we're expecting our preschoolers and early school age kids to have a pretty strong grasp on. Um, and so those that would be typical development for kids that don't have SM. So another question is, what if I have a teen and they're not working on these skills yet? That's what we're going to talk about next is if you need to work on these skills, what are some ideas of how you could work on some of these things? So, how all of this social language kind of development applies to SM, as I said earlier, an early focus of SM treatment is often on answering questions, kind of answering forced choice questions or open ended questions, and then prompting kids to be able to ask their own questions. And that's great. That's a fantastic place to start. That's a really strong foundation. Kids need those skills. And that's a really great way to start eliciting verbalizations from kids in the early stages of treatment. So, if you are here and you're thinking of a child with SM who's not talking at all, yes, I would definitely start there with some of those earlier skills. However, once kids get good at that and they're consistently answering questions from a variety of people, they're consistently asking questions in a variety of situations, I think we need to challenge ourselves to think about what other skills might we need to work on before we are ready to dismiss from treatment or before we're ready to say they don't need any support or they don't need any intervention anymore. And so I would encourage you to think about some of these higher level, more complex skills that we're talking about tonight and think about, are these things that my student or my child still needs to work on? Are these things that my client needs explicit practice and exposures in order to feel proficient and confident in these skills and be using them independently and across contexts? And once we've kind of mastered these things, then I think it's more appropriate to think about dismissal from treatment. So, a place that I would encourage you to start would be to first reflect on what your child or your client is currently doing across different situations. And if you need a more organized framework for how to look at that, I would encourage you to use some kind of social communication checklist. So this is one that I really like. It's available for free online. So I have the link down there. And like I said, you'll get these handouts, so you'll be able to access that. And this is just a snapshot of part of it. This isn't the whole thing. It does divide this up differently than kind of the framework I presented earlier. So it talks about kind of regulatory and personal and interactional skills. But what I like is that it breaks down social language into lots of really specific skills, and then it allows the person completing this to think about, is this a skill that this child is not using at all yet? Is this a skill that they're using kind of non-verbally, so using without words? So are they using gestures or using kind of those pre-verbal skills to engage in this task? Are they doing it kind of minimally with short, like 1 to 3 word types of phrases, or are they doing this using pretty complex language? And so if you kind of have parents and or members of the school team and or members in the community like a soccer coach or a CCD teacher at school at church or something like that. People who are interacting with the child and the client kind of fill this out across different settings. You can start to piece together where are the areas of need here. What are some things that this child has mastered and they're consistent with, and what are some things that we might want to focus our treatment on more specifically in order to help them with these social language skills. Question in the chat is, when it comes to expressing emotions, does this include showing emotion in face, tone, and body language when responding? Their child is verbal but has challenges in this area. I think there's a range there. So I think expressing emotions can be what we're saying verbally, like, oh, I'm really excited about what we're doing this weekend. Oh, I was really frustrated when this happened today. Oh, I'm really disappointed that we can't go to the movies tonight. That's one piece of it. And I think the other piece is that nonverbal piece. So facial expressions, gestures, body language, things like that. I would say with a lot of kids with SM that I've worked on, the verbal piece tends to come first, and that gestural body language piece tends to come later. Although I have worked with kids where it was the opposite, where it was easier for them to kind of show with their body what they were feeling before they could express that verbally. So it could look different depending on your child. You can kind of work on that with them and kind of work on reinforcing those things and modeling it yourself, noticing it in other people. So there's definitely ways that you can kind of target that if you feel like that's something that's really important for your child and their communication skills. So once we've kind of identified areas to work on, these next several sections will kind of talk about some of those specific areas that we might want to hone in on and focus our treatment approaches on. So we're starting first with that initiation piece. So kind of after we've worked on asking questions, answering questions, how do we take that a step further and help our kids initiate interactions with other people, and what does that look like? So this is an example of how you might scaffold that skill. You don't necessarily have to do it exactly this way. It doesn't necessarily have to be in exactly 5 steps. I just happen to lay it out in 5 steps here. But this is just kind of an example of how you might go from more supportive, kind of helping the child with something as this is a brand new skill that you're working on, to then pulling that support away after time, after they've gotten more comfortable and proficient with it, until you get to the point where they're doing the skill independently and you don't have to kind of support or prompt anymore. So, if we're starting with this idea of kind of initiating an interaction by asking a question independently, so being able to kind of start a conversation or start an interaction with a question, you might start by kind of being pretty direct with the prompting that you're doing. So, you might have to help your child think about the exact question that they're going to ask. Your prompt might sound something like, go ahead and ask Liza, are you finished with the scissors? So, you're kind of feeding them word for word what exactly the question is that they're asking. As they're able to do that piece, then you might want to start giving them some more options and kind of control over the situation. So you might kind of give them options of 2 or 3 different questions they could ask in the situation. So your prompt might look more like, do you want to ask Simon, do you have any pets, or do you have any brothers or sisters? So notice we're not saying, do you want to ask Simon a question? Because the answer to that could certainly be your child saying, no, I don't want to do this. This is too hard. This is not something I feel comfortable with. We're giving them several different options of questions that would be appropriate to ask in this situation, and then we're kind of allowing them to choose. So moving from feeding them that question word by word to giving them some more options, but still kind of giving them a lot of structure in terms of what might make the most sense to ask. So from there, you could kind of move to prompting the child or student to think of their own question, but to practice it ahead of time. So they're not kind of thinking of it on the spot in the moment yet. So maybe you might say something like, I think we're going to be talking about ice cream later when we go get ice cream with Liam and his family. So let's think of some questions we could ask Liam about ice cream. So go ahead and think of your question. Now go ahead and tell me your question. Oh, that's a great question. You're going to ask, does he like chocolate or strawberry better? So then when you're in the situation, then you can prompt, oh, remember how we practiced thinking of questions about ice cream? You were going to ask a question about what kind of ice cream Liam likes. Go ahead and ask your question. So again, you're kind of slowly giving your child more independence and more control and agency in this activity because they're now thinking of their own question, but you're kind of still providing some support. And then as you get to that point where they're able to kind of think of their own questions and they're relevant to the situation, now you might start prompting them in the moment, like, oh, remember we're practicing asking questions. go ahead and ask Aaron a question. And you're leaving it more open-ended like that for them to think of the topic and them to think of the question themselves. And then once they get good at that, then you're really backing off the support. And all you're really doing at that point is you might remind the student, oh, remember when we're playing Monopoly today, we're working on asking questions. So I'm going to be listening for you to be asking questions to your friends, and kind of use a nonverbal or a gestural prompt if they need that when you're in the situation, eye contact or some kind of gesture to remind them of what their goal is so that they're asking it independently in that situation. And then ideally, once they're good at that, you'll see them starting to do that more independently without you having to kind of prompt or scaffold it at all. So again, this is just an example of how you might scaffold that. But again, if you're starting with a child who's, not asking, not initiating by asking questions at all yet, you don't necessarily want to jump right into, okay, go ahead and ask some questions, because that might not be enough support for them to be successful. So breaking this down into really giving specifics, giving structures, giving lots of modeling and prompting, and then backing off of that modeling and prompting is really helpful for building that success. So, some ideas of how you might work on asking questions in a more structured way to make sure you get opportunities to practice this skill. If you're in a group setting or a school setting, or you're having a friend over for a play date, there's lots and lots of activities that are available online, or you can make your own so you can make it specific to the child or student you're working with, where you're playing kind of icebreaker or getting to know you games. Sometimes they're called like friendship bingo or getting to know you bingo. And essentially, you just have a grid that has lots of different questions on. And every time you ask a question, you can check one off, and then you try to, get five in a row or get all of the ones on your page or something like that. If you're in a school setting, you could think about creating some kind of review game about the content that they're learning, so it's relevant to the academics and it's a functional academic skill that they're practicing and can apply back to their classroom. Where maybe they have just finished reading a chapter about something, or reading an article about something, and they think of questions about what they've learned and practice asking them to each other, or asking the teacher questions like that. You can play activities where the students don't have all the information. So you put something into a mystery bag and they can't see it, but they have to ask you questions about it, kind of 20 question style. So is it bigger than a toaster? Is it soft? Can you eat it? And then kind of games similar to that, like 20 questions. You can also think about, and this works well for older students too, who are able to read and are able to kind of formulate questions with kind of a starter here, is you can give them kind of the beginning of the question and then let them think of several different ways to finish it. So that might look like saying like, okay, in this activity, we're going to play Would You Rather? And some ways that you could ask questions about that is by saying, why do you like such and such better? Or can you explain why you picked such and such? So giving them kind of those starting sentences and then letting them finish it. And then I've also included a couple examples of some SMART goals here. You'll see this is included for each of the next following sections. I included like 2 or 3 different goals that you could use for an IEP if this is a skill that you're working on in a school-based setting or in another setting where you need to have kind of measurable goals. You can take these goals and kind of tweak them to whatever your student's working on. They don't necessarily need to be exactly in this format, but I just wanted to give you an example of how we might kind of specify this skill in a way that's quantifiable and measurable and very specific to what we're working on in this type of setting. So another way that we can initiate conversations and interactions is by making a comment about something. So you may start a conversation by asking someone a question. You may also start a conversation by making a comment about something that's happening or something that happened recently, a shared experience that you have with that person, things like that. So again, it's difficult to just say to a child who's not doing this at all, like, go ahead and say something, go ahead and make a comment, because they may freeze, they may struggle to think of something. They may kind of have that experience where it feels like their mind goes blank and they don't know what to say. And so we want to provide some scaffolding initially to kind of teach this skill and then pull that scaffolding away as they get better at it. So you might start by using kind of forced choice or open-ended questions to find out what the student thinks about the situation and then prompt them with what to say. So if you just watched a movie as a class, or if you just watched a YouTube clip in your therapy session and you want to know what the student thinks about it, first you might ask some questions like, did you think that was funny or scary? Or what are some words you could think of to describe that movie clip? Or have you seen that before? Or was it new to you? And then once you know what their opinions are, what they're thinking about that, then you can help them figure out what an appropriate comment would be. So you could say something like, well, as we were talking, you told me that you thought that movie was funny. So one thing we could say was, I thought that movie was very funny. Let's practice that. Go ahead and tell me, I thought that movie was really funny. Great. Now we're going to watch another movie clip. If you can tell me if you think it's funny or scary or something like that. So again, you're line feeding them exactly what a comment looks like and what to say about it. And then you might back off of that a little bit and use slightly more open-ended prompts where you're kind of giving them the stem or the beginning part of the sentence and letting them fill it in. So it might look like, okay, for this next movie clip, we're going to watch this movie clip. And then afterwards, you can tell me, I thought that movie was, and then tell me what you thought it was, if it was funny or scary or too long or too short or boring or anything like that. So you're starting that comment for them and letting them kind of finish it with their own opinion or idea. And then you can move to a more general prompt, like you can tell me what you thought about the movie and wait and see if they're able to make that comment with just kind of that indirect prompt or that more open-ended prompt. And then again, kind of moving to that point where we're just reminding students that their goal is to make comments on their own and then give that wait time and give those opportunities for them to make comments about that. Throughout all of these, you can certainly use whatever reinforcement system you've been using with the student to help reinforce the skills that you're working on. So that can certainly be applied to these higher level goals, just the way you've used it in earlier stages of treatment as well. Some activities that might be helpful in kind of targeting this making comments goal. So I've done activities where I've given the students like a scorecard that had like 3 to 5 boxes or spaces on it. And after we did an activity or watched a video, and their goal was to make a comment. And each time they made a comment, they got like a sticker or a check mark or something for one of those boxes. And then we were trying to get all 3 of them or all 5 of them filled up or something like that. Some of it is just kind of doing things that are silly or unexpected and then using nonverbal cues like wait time and kind of making eye contact or facial expressions to see if you can kind of elicit some comments from the student. So looking for those ways to work this into naturalistic opportunities of things that might be happening in your therapy session, in your classrooms, in things like that. You can also play games that require students to call things out on their own without prompting. So if you've ever played card games or board games like Taboo or Outburst, you'll often get a topic like fast food restaurants, and then the players have to call out as many things in that category as they can think of within a certain amount of time. So I like activities like this because one, they're very functional to work on kind of playing age-appropriate games that kids might encounter in other situations. But two, it works on that skill of kind of sharing an opinion, sharing a thought, making a comment without someone directly prompting, what's a fast food restaurant you like, but rather kind of doing it in a more naturalistic way and hopefully prompting multiple repetitions of it. So hopefully they can think of several fast food restaurants or several different colors or several species of birds or whatever the topic is. So those would be some ideas of how you might work on the skill of them initiating an interaction by making a comment themselves. And then there's some examples of some goals here as well. Okay, so that was kind of thinking about initiation. And now we're moving on to some other skills like what I call social niceties or those polite words types of goals. These can often be really hard for our kids with SM. And often the reason is because these are high pressure situations, and these are often situations that kids have a lot of practice avoiding. So there's probably been a lot of situations where kids have been prompted, say hi to so and so, say thank you to so and so, say bye to so and they've not been able to do it yet in those moments. And so they've engaged in avoidance behaviors like avoiding eye contact or moving away from the interaction or letting an adult answer for them or things like that. And so there can be a lot of pressure and a lot of strong avoidance practice built into these words. And so I don't recommend starting with these words. But again, if we've gotten to this point in treatment where we're doing a lot of other things really well and really consistently, it might be appropriate to start working on some of these things because this is something that many people expect in a typical social interaction is that there's going to be some form of greetings, farewells, maybe some of those social polite words, things like that. So, some examples of how you might scaffold this. I use the skill of greetings in this example, but you can certainly apply this scaffolding to any of these types of words. So, you might start by just kind of modeling and accepting nonverbal forms of greeting. So, maybe you just start with waves and high fives and things like that, if that's kind of where you are with this skill, and if it's a really difficult skill for your student or your client. And then you might work on some role play activities. So again, making sure we're doing this with people that are familiar to the student, people that they're already consistently talking to. We don't necessarily want to start this with brand new people, but doing this kind of with people that they're comfortable with and they are able to communicate freely with might make this a little bit easier. And so you might use kind of scripted role play activities where maybe they're reading from a script or you're doing the same kind of scripted interaction over and over and over so that it becomes consistent and they know what to expect. And again, they're not being put on the spot and having to think of it in the moment. Then you might start prompting for kind of short utterances. And again, you can use forced choice questions to give them some options. So, like when we go back into your classroom, do you want to say hi or hey there to your teacher, or hi or hey there to the person sitting next to you? And then you might work on longer greetings, things like how was your weekend, or what did you do for Halloween? Did you go trick or treating? Different types of kind of those conversational openers and greetings and things like that. And then again, moving to those indirect or gestural prompts. So it might be things like, remember, we're practicing saying hi to people today, and then giving some time and some space for your student to walk into the interaction and see if they're able to use those greetings appropriately without you having to directly prompt it. Some ways that you might practice greetings and farewells. Again, bingo games that have some of the target words on. So trying to think of lots of different ways to greet or say goodbye to someone or end a conversation. You could put all of those on a bingo board, and then students walk around the room and they have to practice using these with other people in the group or in the class. And every time they use one of them or use it 5 times, they get to check it off. Within classroom situations, if students are ready for this, they could have a job of being either classroom greeters or morning greeters. And so their job is to either stand by the door and say hi to everybody as they walk in, which would give them like 20 to 25 different opportunities to practice, depending on how many kids are in their class. Or it could be their job to greet people who walk in throughout the day. So if another teacher walks in, if the principal walks in, if the speech therapist walks in, it's their job to be like, hi, welcome to our classroom, or, hi, good to see you, or hi, how can I help you? Another way, I didn't put this on here, but assigning kids to be the telephone answerer if they're in class, and having them practice using greetings when they're answering the phone, like, hi, this is so and so, how can I help you? You can play games like telephone or whisper down the alley, where you're passing on a message to someone, but you have to use a greeting before you pass on the message to get lots of practice with that. And I've also had students be really interested in this. This wasn't necessarily an SM student, but looking up how people in different cultures or languages say hello and practicing it in different ways to just give some opportunities for something other than those high pressure words that we're used to, finding some ways to practice greetings with maybe some words that aren't as familiar and aren't as avoidant practiced, and being able to do that, and then moving on to things that are more typical to the student's own culture. And then some opportunities, some example SMART goals are listed here. For those polite words, so those are words like excuse me, I'm sorry, please, thank you, those types of things. Again, role play and scripted practice is really great. You could think of different scenarios that might be functional for your student, depending on whether they're in a work situation or an extracurricular situation, or different places in the community that they might go, and think about what those interactions might look like. What would it look like if you call to order pizza? What would it look like if you walk into the bookstore and need to ask someone for help? What would that conversation look like? You can also do things where you're reading passages from books or watching video clips, and you have the student listen for those polite words. They can ring a bell or check off a box, and every time they hear or notice those polite words, and then practice those same words at the end. You can pick a polite word. This is something that works better in group settings or in classroom settings. Pick a polite word that's kind of the word of the day or the week, and every time you overhear a student using it, they get a point for it, or they get a reward for it, to kind of make this a larger group activity that everyone's practicing, not just your particular student. And for kids that this is age appropriate for, you can practice with puppets or stuffed animals. Sometimes having something else say the greeting instead of kind of your child themselves, but having them say it as a puppet or as a character or as a figurine, can make it a little bit easier before they practice saying it themselves in an interaction. And then there's some examples of what some of those SMART goals could look like as well. Okay, we're doing well time-wise here. So moving on to some self-advocacy types of topics. This, I think, is such a critical skill for our students to learn. And I think it's such a difficult skill for them to learn because self-advocacy includes things like asking for help. It includes things like being appropriately assertive, which means stating an opinion about something, telling a peer to stop something if it's bothersome or upsetting to them or hurtful in some way, being able to stand up for themselves and kind of defend themselves if needed. And these are skills that our kids often need to use on a daily basis, if not multiple times a day. And they can be really difficult for any kid, not just kids with SM, because there's a there's an amount of vulnerability that's involved in this, right? So if you're asking for help, you're admitting that you can't do something and that you need help with it. And that can be really hard for some of our kids. Again, not just kids with SM, but lots of kids on my caseload are working on these self-advocacy types of skills. And so, again, this isn't something that I would start with in treatment right away. I would build some other skills first, but I definitely think this is a topic that's worth spending some time on and making sure your student can do this consistently so that they're able to use these skills in kind of these high pressure situations. I think that's another thing that can make these skills really hard is when we're advocating for ourselves, it's usually in some type of emotional situation. There's something going on and we're, upset about something or frustrated with something or worried about something, and we need to ask for help or share an opinion or ask someone to stop doing something. And so that heightened emotional state can make it harder to kind of use these communication skills as well. And so I think it's really critical to practice, practice, practice these skills so that they become so second nature to the student that they're able to still use those and access those in those potentially high emotional moments. So, thinking about what scaffolding might look like for some of these self advocacy skills. Again, you might start by kind of accepting nonverbal forms of self advocacy. So, if you've got a student who's not yet ready to ask for help verbally, maybe something where they use kind of a hand signal, just practicing raising their hand to indicate that they need help with something, using some kind of visual like a card that indicates that they need help or a card that indicates they need a break from something if they're feeling very frustrated with it and need to kind of take a breather from it. So starting potentially with some of those nonverbal forms and then moving on to more scripted types of things where they're practicing this in very structured situations. So you might be playing a game and you pause the game and kind of practice, what would it look like if you needed help right now? What would it look like if you couldn't remember what to do next? What could we ask? Let's practice asking that. So then starting to prompt for some of those shorter verbal phrases using forced choice questions. So again, giving that option, but kind of giving some structure to it. So do you want to say help, please, or I need help? So giving some different options where you're modeling to your student or your client, these are acceptable ways to ask for help. These are ways that you could put this into words and ask for it, and then giving them some agency over choosing how they're going to do that in the moment. So looking for those real world situations where you can kind of give those options, and then starting to prompt for kind of more complex or more specific types of statements. So instead of just help, please, prompting for, can you repeat the directions, please? Or I didn't hear the last part. What am I supposed to do next? So giving kind of those more specific prompts. And again, you can start with kind of feeding them this word for word and then moving on to more general prompts like, it's okay to ask for help if you need it, or it looks like you're not sure what to do next. I wonder what you could ask if you need some help. So giving kind of those more general open-ended prompts that allow the student to kind of think of those and formulate those statements on their own. And then making sure you're really reinforcing and celebrating any of those advocacy moments. So, if you catch the student asking for help, even if it's, something simple like, can you tie my shoes for me? Or can you hold this for me? Or can you get me another one? Any of those kind of moments where it's happening spontaneously and naturalistically in everyday interactions, making sure you're noticing that and being like, wow, that you did such a great job asking me for help. You did such a great job telling me what you needed in that situation. I love how you're using your words to advocate for yourself and making sure we're using those specific phrases to really reward and reinforce those things. There's a question in the chat. Does celebrating these moments trigger the child with SM? I think the answer to that is it depends. I think it depends a lot on the situation and what's going on around you and your specific child. So I can think of some situations where I've worked with kids with SM where if it was just the two of us and I was using some specific labeled praise like that, they were completely fine with it. But if we were in a larger classroom setting and a lot of their peers were around, they didn't like that much attention being put on them. So it depended on the situation. I can think of other kids where initially that praise was really helpful for them. And then as they progressed through treatment, it kind of got old and they didn't want so much of that anymore. And they wanted maybe a more subtle form of acknowledgement, or like, hey, that was really great the way you did that. Or even something just kind of nonverbal, some kind of gesture that you gave them, or something that didn't draw a lot of attention to them. So I think you can probably experiment with things. And as you get to know your student or your child and what works for them and what doesn't work for them, you can kind of adapt it to that situation. Some examples where you can practice the skill of asking for help. So you can practice act opportunities where you switch roles with the student. So maybe the student plays the therapist or the teacher or the adult or the parent in that situation, and they practice helping the adult with something. And there's lots of ways that you can make this very functional for your kids. So if you've got a student who's into something that you don't know much about, like I had a student explaining the movie K-pop Demon Hunters to me the other day because I don't know anything about it. Roblox, Minecraft, a movie that they're into, a music group that they like, something that's big on YouTube or social media right now. There's lots of ways that you can have them explain something that they're an expert in to you, who may not be an expert in that, and kind of give them those opportunities to be the person who's providing the help, and then switch roles and then have them be the person who's asking for help. You can also intentionally give directions that are vague, like go ahead and put the piece there and not tell them what the piece is or where exactly it needs to go, and provide those opportunities for them to say, wait, the piece of what? Or where do you want me to put it? Or should I put it on the top or the bottom? Or which puzzle piece do you want me to use? You can also give them directions to complete a task, but not give them all the materials that they need. So I've had in situations where I've given a student I had a situation where I brought a bunch of students back to my classroom and I said, go ahead and sit down in a chair. And I had taken all of the chairs out of the classroom. So they had to say things like, where are the chairs? And where do you want us to sit? And why did you take the chairs out? Things like giving them a worksheet and saying, go ahead and cut out the pieces, but don't give them scissors. And then they have to say, can I have scissors, please? Or something like that. So providing those kind of naturalistic but scaffolded situations where it elicits asking for help in a very naturalistic way. Also kind of them earning some kind of ticket or check mark or something each time they ask for help, and then being able to trade those in for some kind of reward. Um, Question in the chat. What if your child has been in therapy for several years, but all you are seeing is still the head nods? Do we change therapy or start over? What to do in order to see more progress? Again, I think that's a question where it depends. I think it would be worth looking at, without knowing your specific situation or what the child's working on, the situations where you're getting the head nods and maybe breaking those down and thinking about, is there kind of one particular situation we can work on? It also might have to do with how you're prompting the situation. So if you're prompting with a yes or no question, like, do you need scissors? And the child's nodding, maybe switching your prompt to a forced choice question, like, do you need scissors or glue to be able to finish this? Because then you can't just easily nod to answer that question. You have to kind of verbally indicate your choices there, somehow. So it might be worth kind of thinking about, do we need to focus on a specific situation and kind of break this down, more specifically, or do we need to change how we're prompting things? Do we need to change how we're reinforcing things? Maybe if you've been using the same reinforcement or reward for a long time and that's not reinforcing anymore, you might need to shake things up and change kind of what the motivator is. So there can be lots of different ways to kind of work through that. But I think that's a great question, because I do think sometimes we can get very stuck in using the same responses for something, and we do need to shift things a little bit. As I said, another form of self-advocacy, so not just asking for help, can be being appropriately assertive. So we can kind of teach kids the language about this. So we can kind of teach kids there's different ways to respond to things. There's ways we can respond to situations that are passive, that are aggressive, and that are assertive, and model and role play those different activities. So teaching them what that looks like, giving examples of what that looks like, identifying characters who are engaging in ways that are passive, aggressive, or assertive, talking about the pros and cons, talking about which of those makes the most sense in this scenario and why. So making sure we're really explicitly teaching, what does assertiveness mean? What does it include? What does it look like? What does it sound like? And also, what does it not include? So what's the difference between being appropriately assertive and maybe inappropriately or overly assertive? Um, Giving students examples of assertive statements. So things like, I'd like a turn now, please stop doing that, I don't like that. And giving them options then to use those phrases within a scenario or a game or an activity. So you can both act out a specific scenario and have them practice using phrases, or you could do kind of a functional activity like playing a board game, or doing some kind of cooperative activity where they have to use those statements in naturalistic situations, and then moving that to kind of more and more open-ended types of things. Um, like I said, acting out situations. So you can talk to the teacher, the parents, people who are working with the student, and think about what are situations that the student is encountering or has encountered that they've struggled with, and how can we talk through and practice those situations so that the student has the language, has the practice, and kind of has that script for what to do if it happens again. So if someone is often cutting in front of them in line and they're not able to say anything about it, maybe that's one that you practice. If someone is not listening to them when they ask someone to stop doing something, someone's doing something that bothers them, if the student's not able to say, hey, that hurts, hey, I don't like that, hey, I can't concentrate, working on those specific situations so it's relevant to the student and to their life. Um, it can also be helpful to give students, and this goes really well for older students as well, to kind of give them social dilemmas, and have them give advice. So, what would they say to a peer who was going through this situation? And then have them kind of practice using those situations. And that can give them good experience thinking of ways that are appropriately assertive, that maybe don't have them being the center of the role yet if they're not ready for that, but helps them sort of thinking along those lines of what would assertiveness look in this situation? What would it sound like? What would I say? What would I do? What would I tell someone else to say or do? Can be a good way to practice those skills to make sure they really understand that concept before we're asking them to use it in a real world situation. And then there's examples of some goals there. Shifting on now to peer relationships and thinking about things like negotiations and compromises, which can be, again, a higher level tricky skill for a lot of our students, not just our students with SM. So many kids at all levels of schooling, elementary, at preschool, all the way up through high school and beyond, are learning how do we appropriately negotiate and compromise? How do I um, get what I need out of this interaction, but also acknowledge what the other person needs? How do we make sure everybody's needs are met in a way that feels fair and safe and appropriate, and enjoyable, and all of those things? So you can think about activities like building something together. So something collective that they have to work on, an art project, a block tower, a Lego creation, but give them limited materials. So maybe you give them a task like you need to build a bridge with these popsicle sticks, but you only give them 10 or 15 popsicle sticks. And then they have to kind of problem solve and negotiate in that actual situation to solve that problem or do that task in a way that's low stakes and doesn't kind of have a lot of pressure built onto it because it's just kind of a game that you're doing in your therapy session. Giving situations, so giving a situation where there's some kind of disagreement, and then give prompts for what different types of negotiation phrases might sound like or statements might sound like, and letting them pick which one they like or which one they would want to use, and then practicing that in kind of role play situations. Giving would you rather situations, and thinking about students picking different sides and then compromising to find kind of a middle ground there. You can do debate topics with older students who are able to do some of those debate things, and then kind of once they've thought of their arguments for their side, then thinking about how can we compromise and kind of get the best parts of both of these sides of arguments, or how can we acknowledge both of these things. You can have students work in small groups to create something collaboratively. So they have to create an invention together. They have to create a classroom rule and explain why it's important. They have to make a poster for something. And that all requires a lot of turn taking and sharing ideas and hearing other people's ideas. And throughout these kinds of, small group types of activities, making sure that you're monitoring the situation and that your student isn't just pulling back and letting the other people in the group kind of drive the interaction and express their opinions, making sure that your student has those opportunities, and using some of those scaffolding skills that we've talked about all throughout to kind of give either direct models of, oh, it looked like you wanted to do something a little bit different, so go ahead and say, I have a different idea, and kind of doing that line feeding, and then backing off to less and less direct prompting and more open-ended prompting of like, go ahead and tell them what your idea is, or go ahead and think of another way you can do it, or go ahead and share your opinion, and giving some of those prompts because our kids might need some of that scaffolding before they're just using these skills independently. All right, I know there's a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to finish this section and then I will come back to those questions. Sharing opinions is a skill that I think is important for our kids to work on, and there's lots of fun ways that we can work on this. You can do this in kind of, again, really low stakes ways. So just picking things that you like. Things like, do you like cats or dogs better? Do you like pizza or tacos better? And having kids first pick what they like. So kind of pick their preference, but then share their opinion about why they like that. So I like pizza better because tacos are really messy and I don't like to get messy. So I'd rather eat pizza. I heard a student explaining this in a session today. They were talking about whether cats or dogs are better. And she said, I like dogs better because cats have claws that go in and out, and that freaks me out. And I'd rather just have dogs because their claws just stay the same all the time. So prompting students to kind of pick something and explain why they like that. You can have students sort things into things that they like and love, things that they don't like or they're not sure about, and then explain their reasoning for that. You can play a game called Hot Seat, where students are kind of given lots of different opinion questions like, what's the best superpower? What's the best subject in school? What's the best movie you've ever seen? What's the best type of music? And again, you can scaffold this. So you can provide really prompted sentence starters and kind of statements for them to use that are readily made, and then move on to them doing it more independently as they're ready for that. You can play games where you label parts of the room like agree, disagree, or not sure, or just agree and disagree. And then you read a statement and have the students pick a side. And then they have to ask the other people in their group, why do you agree with this or why do you disagree with this? And practice some of those things. Thinking about ways to practice this within group discussions that are happening naturalistically in either your therapy groups or in your classroom situations. And then there's some examples of some SMART goals there. So in summary, what I've kind of tried to touch on tonight as we've talked about some of these topics is asking and answering questions are really critical skills and really important parts of the therapy process. And those skills alone are not enough for our kids to be successful in all of the complicated and complex and nuanced social interactions that they're going to be faced with, even at the preschool and elementary school level. And so we want to make sure we're thinking about these higher level social language skills, addressing the ones that are appropriate and relevant to our students or clients or kids, and working on things like initiating conversations, making comments, advocating for themselves, negotiating, because those are all things that are really helpful for them having meaningful interactions and building relationships with people, both peers and adults. We can use activities that are motivating and interesting and relevant to the child's interest, and we can use really intentional scaffolding to start by providing lots of support initially, teaching that skill really explicitly, giving lots of examples and non-examples of what this skill is and what it's not. And then as students are ready, pulling back that support so we're challenging them to take some agency and have some independence and start using that skill more independently. And then hopefully that generalizes to other situations and activities. And then Dr. Steve Kurtz, I think, popularized the phrase living the exposure lifestyle, which I just love. And a lot of this is just looking for opportunities to practice these skills in real world settings. And if we're seeing our kids engage in situations and they're struggling, thinking of ways that we can then bring that back to our therapy sessions or back to our exposures or back to our classroom routines, and thinking about ways that we can break those situations down into smaller skills and help them to practice and build those skills so they can do it more successfully on their own next time. And then finally, some resources for you for more information. The Selective Mutism website has lots and lots of resources for you. I would invite you to check out our YouTube channel that has many of our previous webinars on, including one called Differentiating Exposures at School that I did with Dr. Rachel Bessman, that has lots more examples of how to work on specific skills in a school-based setting, if that's relevant to you. And then for those of you working with school teams, the Educator's Toolkit and Educator's Web Course are great resources for you as well. So I know there are some questions in the chat, so I want to pop back to that because we have a few minutes left to address some of these. Recommendations on social skills group to practice these goals in face-to-face or virtual settings. I don't have recommendations for specific groups, but I do think that social skills groups can be really practical and helpful for our kids if they're working at the level that our kids are ready for. So if your student is not yet verbal with the person leading the social skills group or with the other kids in that social skills group, they may need to do some practice with those people before they can benefit from the actual instruction in that group. If it's working on skills that our kids need to work on and that person is kind of trained in using scaffolding and reinforcement and prompting techniques, techniques that are relevant to what your student's working on, I think they can be really wonderful ways to practice a lot of these skills. And as I said, these are skills that many kids are practicing, not just our kids with SM. And so there may be other kids in their school or in their extracurricular settings, or in outside therapy settings who are working on these skills, and it's beneficial to work on those skills together in a group. Our son is doing a lot of these skills, but only in a whisper. We can't seem to break through for using a full voice. So, great question. Probably an entirely different topic is moving from kind of whispering or low audible voices to more full audible voices. But depending on the age of your son and kind of what he's able to engage in, sometimes we have to break therapy down into working on kind of airflow activities and then working on voicing just sound effects or vowel sounds without it being actual words, and then slowly building up to words. Sometimes you can also work on just really upping the reinforcement for using a louder voice, or um, working on something where functionally he has to talk louder. So if you start off standing right next to him and he can whisper to you and you can hear him, and then you move to across the room where he whispers and you functionally can't hear him anymore, sometimes that kind of physical prompt can be enough to kind of elicit a little bit of a louder voice. And then as soon as you hear that, making sure you're really heavily reinforcing, like, I heard you get louder, I heard you use your voice for that one. Great job speaking in your loud voice, and making sure that you're rewarding that effort that he is engaging in. Yes, psychologists can also work on these skills. Lots of different professionals might be involved in working on these skills. So this is something that social workers may work on, speech therapists may work on, psychologists may work on, behavior analysts may work on. So there could be lots of different professionals who are working on those skills. Looking at some of these other questions, talking about pragmatic deficits or anxiety that prevents the child from demonstrating these skills. So that's a great question. So the question is it, are we practicing these skills because the child doesn't have these social language skills, or are we practicing these skills because their anxiety is interfering with their ability to use these social language skills? And I think both things can be true. I think sometimes kids may have these skills in some situations, so they may be doing these things at home or with familiar people very comfortably, but not doing them in other situations, which is kind of a hallmark characteristic of SM. And so we need to practice these exposures to practice doing it until the anxiety is no longer interfering with it. So again, breaking it down into little pieces, scaffolding it, being really intentional about moving through this gradually so that we're not jumping too far and making this an extremely anxiety provoking situation. So we're practicing it to help gradually expose the child to these situations and reduce the anxiety that's associated with them. In other situations, I do think either because kids have had such anxiety, they haven't practiced these skills very much, they may have weaknesses in these areas. And so some of our kids do have deficits in pragmatic skills, and so they do benefit from that explicit teaching and that explicit practice. And so I think we always want to err on the side of over teaching this skill and kind of giving our kids the explicit instruction and the words to use, and then backing off of that support, because that will help in both situations, whether they're truly lacking the skill or whether it's anxiety preventing them from using this skill. Yes, there are webinars about teens on the YouTube channel. So yes, definitely check that out. Um, and I'm just trying to make sure we hit most of these questions with the time that we have left. How do you balance living the exposure lifestyle while also keeping balance in the child or teen's life, like allowing them to have much needed downtime, especially with busy high school students? Great question. And I think that's an important question because, yes, I don't think any of us can constantly be pushed to do something that's really hard and challenging and uncomfortable every minute without having some recovery time. And so I think that balance will look different for everybody. I think you'll probably have to play around with it a little bit. And I think it's okay to be a little bit uncomfortable, to push your child or teen to do something that's a little bit hard, but not be doing that constantly in every situation, every moment of every day, because you're right, there could be some burnout then, and that could be really difficult. So, thinking about what are the situations that are most important to me and my child, what are the situations that are most functional for them to practice, that they really need the skills in, and how do we prioritize those things? And then what are some things that I'm willing to put to the side right now, and then we can come back to and work on later. I think that'll vary for each individual case. With social skills classes in school, if my daughter's not yet talking in class, how can we help make sure this is effective to help her? I would talk to your school about who the person is who's leading that and see if you can do something like a fade in. So, a very structured way of kind of passing the talking from you or for someone your child's able to talk to that person who's leading it. Maybe starting with one on one sessions with that person and then slowly integrating her into the group as she's ready for that. So thinking about ways that you might kind of break that down into smaller steps before just jumping into a group with a bunch of people that she's not talking to yet. Because I agree, first we have to establish the talking, then we can work on those higher level skills. Um, I think we've hit most of these. Oh, there's a couple questions about moving from individual sessions to small groups. So having students who are responding really well to intervention and prompts in individual sessions, so one-on-one sessions with the professional, but then when trying to incorporate new people, it can be difficult, and we're seeing some challenges there. Yeah, I think that's certainly a struggle. And I think some of that, so using a really good fade in process, so making sure that you've got someone who the student is comfortable and able to talk to consistently, and you're very slowly and gradually introducing that new person in. It may take several sessions to do that. We don't have time to get into the whole fade in process now, but we do have lots of other tools on our website that explain that process. Also including the student in who those other people are going to be that you're going to transition talking to. So maybe giving them either pictures or names of all the peers in their class and letting them pick the top three that they want to practice talking to, or of several different teachers, letting them pick the teachers that they want to practice talking to. Getting some input from them and getting some buy-in from them could be really helpful, because maybe it's someone you're not thinking of that could be really motivating for the student. So maybe you really want to work on talking to their classroom teacher, but they're particularly interested in talking to their art teacher. And so you start there and then kind of build and generalize from there. Um, thank you all for wonderful, wonderful questions and participation. I apologize that we are out of time and have to wrap things up for tonight, but please definitely check out the SMA website and YouTube channel for lots of other resources. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this is helpful information for you for working on some of these higher level skills, so that our kids can be successful in lots and lots of different interactions.